In this video, I'll be giving you my thoughts on the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 autofocus lens for the Fujifilm X system. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to offer you my thoughts on Yongnuo's 50mm f1.8 autofocus lens for the Fujifilm X system. Now, this lens comes in two flavors: the regular version that has an official retail price of around $135, and a quote-unquote pro version that retails for around $320. Now, Yongnuo sent me this regular version of the lens for testing, and I do get to keep it. However, they don't get to see this video before it goes live, and they don't have any input on it whatsoever, so all the thoughts here are my own. So let's jump in and take a look at what this lens has to offer. The first thing I noticed when I took this lens out of the box was just how plasticky it felt. Now, Yongnuo lists the material that this lens is made of as PC, which I'm guessing is polycarbonate, so it should be a fairly sort of sturdy, strong plastic that can hold up to a few knocks, but it definitely feels a lot more plasticky, especially when you compare it to Fujifilm's lenses. Now, the mount, thankfully, is made of machined metal, according to Yongnuo, but they don't tell you what type of metal it is. However, it does mount smoothly to all of my cameras, so no real complaints there. Now, in terms of size, the lens is roughly the same length as the 50mm f2 from Fujifilm, but it's a little bit chubbier. Now, presumably that's to accommodate some slightly larger elements and also an autofocus motor that may not have been miniaturized quite as much as the Fujifilm lens. The lens barrel has a large focusing ring on it that is quite loose and also feels pretty plasticky. Now, manual focusing with this is smooth, and you can actually hear the stepping motors sort of doing their job, as this is a focus-by-wire system. Now, noticeably, there is no physical aperture ring on this lens, and that's always a little bit of a disappointment for me when it comes to a Fujifilm mount lens, because it just sort of takes me out of the moment a little bit, because I need to remember that I'm no longer using one of my XF lenses, and then I actually have to adjust the aperture on the body. Now, it's just a muscle memory thing, and it jolts me out basically of that moment every time. Now, it wouldn't be a huge issue if you only use lenses that don't have aperture rings, but it's very noticeable when you're switching from a lens that does have one to a lens that doesn't. Well, finally, Yongnuo includes a basic plastic lens hood in the box that should help to reduce flare from any stray light, and it certainly does its job, but mounting it to the lens makes a bit of a scratchy plastic sound, and it makes a bit of a creaking noise when you're holding the lens if you happen to pinch it a little bit too hard. So let me see if the microphones can pick this up for you. So there you go. It's just a little bit of an annoyance, and something that I just sort of notice every couple of times I'm out with this lens, just sort of, ooh, that doesn't sound right. But otherwise, it does its job and it's just fine. Like many other manufacturers making autofocus lenses for the Fujifilm X system these days, Yongnuo provides a firmware update capability for this lens. Now, updates can be made by connecting the lens to a computer using the USB-C port at the bottom of the lens barrel. Now, as with some other manufacturers, Yongnuo's firmware updates site is, it's a little bit convoluted, and it might not be so easy to navigate for some people. Now, I really hope that we can see quite a bit of improvement there so that firmware updates are a little easier to find. Now, in addition, that USB-C port is actually on the bottom of the lens barrel, and that's completely open to the elements at all times. So you're really going to want to be careful of sweat and water and dust and all those sorts of things that you really do not want inside of your lens. Now, that issue could have been solved very, very easily by just including a little rubber cap or a gasket to go over the top of this, and then it wouldn't have been an issue, but as it stands, this is a little bit worrisome. Autofocus on this lens is driven by a stepping motor that has been swift and accurate in my testing. Now, in single AF, it locks on quickly and quietly, and in AFC, it tracks as well as we would expect from any stepping motor. Now, I would say that it's just a little bit slower and a little bit noisier than the ones we find in Fujifilm's lenses, like the XF 50mm f2, but it's really not much of a difference, and unless you had the two side by side, you really wouldn't even notice it. So as you can see, overall at this price, it's really hard to fault the autofocus on this lens. It does what it says on the box, it gets images in focus quickly and quietly. As we look at sharpness with this lens, I'll first look at it in a vacuum and then compare it to its natural competitor from Fujifilm, which is the XF50mm f2. Now, while the latter is much more expensive, it has the same focal length and a very similar maximum aperture. So, at f1.8, the center of the image it's okay. We get a good amount of detail, but nothing to really write home about. Now, it quickly gets better by f2, and it stays relatively the same through about f4. At f5.6 and f8, we see the best detail from this lens, and of course, after that, it begins to deteriorate through diffraction. As for the far corners though, they're quite mushy from f1.8 to f4 and only begin to really get acceptable by f5.6 and f8. Now this is the far corners that I'm talking about though, and it's not likely that many types of photography, especially the kinds looking to budget lenses for their needs, are going to be concerned about this level of performance. If we do compare this lens to the XF50mm f2, they're about equal in the center when both are used wide open, but the XF lens quickly takes the lead throughout the rest of the aperture range. It shows significantly more detail in the central area of the frame after f2.8. The contrast is also a little bit better to my eye. As for the corners, the XF50mm f2 does quite well wide open and then sharpens up significantly by f2.8. So if you are looking for sharp images all the way across the frame, the extra money would be well spent on the XF lens. However, for most people, I'd say you'll be just fine with the Yongnuo lens. Now, on a final note, we often see with budget lenses, they tend to be quite sharp when you focus very, very close, but at farther focus distances, they tend to get a little bit soft or not be able to focus all that well. Thankfully, this lens produces good detail at any distance in my testing, so no worries there. Chromatic aberration can be a bit of an issue with this lens, especially at wider apertures. Now, even on a cloudy day like this, I noticed quite a bit of CA, and it's noticeable even before zooming in, which means that it could really become an issue for certain types of photography. Now, it's nowhere near as offensive as some lenses out there, but it's definitely something you'll need to be aware of when you're using this lens at wider apertures. At f1.8, the vignette produced by this lens is quite dark. In the extreme corners, it's around about 2 stops darker than the center. Now by f2, that improves significantly, and by f4, it's almost gone and you wouldn't notice it in day-to-day shooting. Now, after that, it's no worries at all. When it comes to coma, there is a little bit visible at f1.8 and f2, but it's gone by f2.8. So for the most part, there won't be any funkiness when shooting this lens at night. Looking at the bokeh balls produced by this lens at night, we can see a few characteristics that will translate across to our everyday usage. Now, they're mostly evenly lit with no onion rings or other distractions, aside from the occasional slightly brighter outer ring that shows up with certain light sources. Now, there's a little bit of cat's eye bokeh towards the corners, so we should expect a slight swirl to the bokeh. And also, as the lens is stopped down, the bokeh takes on the shape of the 7 aperture blades very quickly, so there should be a marked difference when we use the lens wide open versus stopped down. Looking at the bokeh and the way we actually use it in most photography, it's easy to see that it does exactly what we need. Foregrounds and backgrounds blur nicely and don't distract from the subject in any meaningful way. We do see a little bit of that CA that I mentioned at wider apertures, but it diminishes as we stop down. Now, bokeh does get a little busy as we stop down, but that's to be expected, especially in a scene like this. Overall, the bokeh is likely to satisfy most people, and with an aperture of f1.8 on a lens of this focal length, it's plentiful at most distances. Sunstars begin to show up at f4, but they're nothing really special. They're not too defined, they're not too large, they don't really take over the image in any way, so for most purposes this is exactly what we want. Just a simple addition to the image that doesn't distract from the other elements. When it comes to flare and ghosting, there's definitely some to be seen. Now, we haven't had a lot of bright days here in Seoul while I've had the lens, but I have taken it with me at every opportunity to stress test it. In this simple test, you can see quite a bit of flare and also ghosts appearing from f1.8. Now, these stick around throughout the entire aperture range, and they're nothing particularly interesting, so I'd say just try to avoid them whenever possible. Now, as you can see, the flare is also there at f1.8, but it disappears very quickly, and by f2.8, it's not really an issue anymore. One thing I did notice on one of our sunny days, but haven't been able to reliably replicate since, was a hint of that ghosting that's shaped like a big red ring. Now, it wasn't quite as prevalent or easy to find as the ones we get from some of, say, Laowa's lenses, but still something that could be useful, and I hope that I can find a few more examples of it before this video goes live. 50mm is quite a long focal length on an APS-C sensor, so it's worth keeping in mind that it's not the classic 50mm lens, at least in practice, that Yongnuo's Amazon page suggests. So for those who like to convert formats in order to understand, this would be equivalent to a 75mm lens on a full-frame camera, making it much closer to a traditional portrait focal length than the quote-unquote normal lens. But that aside, it's a really fun focal length to work with, and you can get some really interesting images. Isolating subjects is easy with a long focal length and wide aperture combination like this, and I've definitely enjoyed being able to pick out parts of a scene to photograph or eliminate distractions in an otherwise busy composition. I've taken this lens out in the rain and snow a couple of times, and while I was a bit nervous about it and certainly babying it a lot more than I would have with something like the weather-sealed XF50mm f2, it did hold up in temperatures down to -8 Celsius, which is this many degrees for our American friends, and it was just fine. But when I got home though, I immediately put it into a Ziploc bag to acclimatize slowly to the warmer temperatures so as not to cause any condensation inside the lens or the more expensive camera that it was attached to. Well, this has definitely been a good lens as a sort of a longer option for documenting daily life. Things like photos of my food, my coffee, walks around town, portrait of my wife here and there. But again, as with many of these sort of budget third-party lenses, I wouldn't recommend it for professional use. It's a little softer than I would like, it suffers from quite a bit of CA, it has a little bit more flare and ghosting, vignetting than I might like, and the build quality may not hold up to all situations without worry. Overall, Yongnuo has produced a decent quality budget lens here. The aggressive pricing means that you really do get a lot for your money. So the autofocus is swift and accurate, the sharpness is quite good around the center of the frame, and the corners do get better as you stop down, although they're not wonderful. The bokeh is also quite good. But there's a little bit of CA present and quite a heavy vignette. Now, a couple of disappointments in terms of the actual lens itself would be the lack of an aperture ring and also the lack of a cover for that firmware port. So if you do need things like weather sealing, sharper images all the way across the frame, less aberrations, that sort of thing, then maybe the Fujifilm X f50mm f2 or even the Pro version of this lens from Yongnuo would be a better option for those sorts of things. However, if what you're looking for is a budget lens that produces decent images and will just sort of get out of the way and do its job, then this is definitely something worth looking into. So I'd actually be very interested to see how this compares against Yongnuo's Pro version and also against Fujifilm's XF50mm f2. So Yongnuo, if you're watching, you know where to reach me. But as always, thanks to everyone for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers!